Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiana Manpour in London, where the British government joins the United States and Europe condemning Israel's government plans to permit 10,000 new settlement units in the occupied West Bank. They say it'll, quote, undermine efforts to achieve a negotiated two-state solution. It is just the latest as Israel's new far-right coalition faces a barrage of criticism, including from its staunchest ally, Washington. President Joe Biden took the unprecedented step of questioning any effort to undermine Israel's independent judiciary, telling the New York Times the genius of American democracy and Israeli democracy is that they are both built on strong institutions, on checks and balances, on an independent judiciary. Building consensus for fundamental change is really important to ensure that the people buy into them so they can be sustained. In a moment, I'll be speaking exclusively about this to Israel's former ambassador to France, who has resigned because she feels she could no longer serve this government. But first, we want to bring you the picture from inside Israel with correspondent Hadass Gold on the policy and the protesters who are determined not to let it pass.
By the tens of thousands, protesters streamed into Jerusalem with drums, flags, signs, chanting and singing songs. One of the largest demonstrations for Jerusalem in years, as these protesters skipped work and school to stand against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government's sweeping judicial reform plans, fundamentally altering the balance of power by allowing Parliament to overturn Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority. Now, for weeks, tens of thousands of Israelis have been coming out to the streets of Tel Aviv to protest. But on Monday, on the day these judicial reforms were first formally introduced in the Israeli parliament, they decided to come here to Jerusalem so that the shouts of the tens of thousands could be heard in the halls of the parliament.
Just because they won a slim majority doesn't mean that the right is with them. Changing the spirit and the life of the country from a democracy to a totalitarian regime, we don't want to go there.
Inside the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, the reform passing its first legislative test in a committee hearing. To ferocious protests from opposition lawmakers who jumped over tables yelling shame and disgrace before being forcibly removed by security. Netanyahu accusing opposition leaders of deliberately dragging the country into anarchy, urging them to show responsibility and leadership. The night before, Israeli President Isaac Herzog's plea in a televised address for consensus and a warning.
We are at a moment before a confrontation, even a violent confrontation. The powder keg is about to explode, and brothers are about to raise their hands against brothers.
Even U.S. President Joe Biden weighing in, saying it's the genius of American and Israeli democracies that were built on strong institutions, on checks and balances, and on an independent judiciary. Perhaps the message received. Monday evening, after the protesters cleared the streets, an announcement from the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, that while they weren't going to stop the legislative process, they will meet with opposition leaders to at least start negotiations.
Hadass Gold reporting there. More than 100 former Israeli diplomats wrote to Netanyahu protesting any changes to the judiciary, and at least one serving diplomat has resigned. She is Yael German. She was Israel's ambassador to France until just 2 days ago. In December, she had sent this message to the Prime Minister, quote, I cannot lie to myself and continue representing a policy that is so radically different from everything that I believe in. And she is joining me now from Tel Aviv for her first interview since stepping down. Ambassador Yael German, welcome to the program.
Good evening.
Can I ask you straight out, what exactly about this did you resign over? Why was it so important and so cataclysmic for you that you have stepped aside?
Well, first of all, as you know, my office is a trust office. It means that I got it from trust, by trust, from the prior Prime Minister, Mr. Yair Lapid. He gave it to me because he trusted me, and I got it because I trusted him and the policy of the government that he was ahead of. But I told him then, and it was very, very clear for me, that the moment that the government will change, I will quit my office, because then I didn't get the trust from the previous government. And the previous government, I can't represent their values as I believe in other values.
So let me get this straight. You are saying that you are a political appointee by the previous government, which has a completely different policy than the current government. Are you saying that that is the only reason why you resigned, and therefore why not? Or are you saying that something about this particular policy has troubled you? I guess what I'm trying to understand is, what is it about this particular policy, if anything, that has caused your action?
When you are having a trust policy, when you are having a trust office, then it comes out of trust. I trusted my Yair Lapid, my former Prime Minister of Israel, and he trusted me. The moment that the government changed and there came another government and another Prime Minister, obviously, then there is no trust between them and me. And I think I had to resign, whether I like the policy or not.
Okay, well, that's important then. That's important then, to make that clarification,
Yes.
that you're not necessarily resigning over this policy. So let me ask you, I reported that 105, at least, former Israeli diplomats did send a letter to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after the coalition assumed office, warning about Israel's global status and standing if the independent judiciary was compromised. Do you agree with that? And if so, in what way do you think Israel's global status might be compromised?
Well, first of all, I do appreciate this letter, and I would have signed this letter should they ask me. And they're absolutely right to warn the government against what's going to be a tsunami against Israel. But I would like to really to point out that what we are doing now in Israel, and the reason that I came back, is because we are now fighting for our character. The character of Israel is a country, is a Jewish and democratic country, and we are now fighting for our democracy. And we won't let anyone change this character.
Okay. Well, first I want to ask you, what do you mean about a tsunami coming against Israel? What kind of tsunami? From where?
Diplomatic. From all the countries that cherish, love, and have relations with Israel, because Israel is the only democracy in our region. It's one of our treasures, the democracy. And now, if we are going to lose it, we are going to lose a lot in the public opinion of the world.
Well, as I said, you saw me cite the number of governments which have protested the settlement policy, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I want to ask you, because, you know, President Macron of France, where you represented Israel, has said to Benjamin Netanyahu when he visited recently that, at least according to the Times of Israel, that Paris should conclude that Israel has emerged from a common conception of democracy if this legislation on the Supreme Court and the judiciary goes through. Do you agree with that? I mean, I think you've just said that it would undermine your democracy.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, actually, President Macron set a red line, and he said that should this legislation pass, then we won't be any more democracy. And that is a red line. And as you heard what President Biden said, again, quite an unprecedented commentary on an internal Israeli matter, but he also made the same point. And Senator Dick Durbin, who
obviously, like most Americans and certainly legislators, are long-term and very strong supporters of Israel. He said he's concerned that Netanyahu, your prime minister, is putting his own narrow political and legal interests ahead of the long-term interests and needs of Israel. Netanyahu fully denies that. Do you believe this is a personal thing, or is it bigger?
I would like to tell you something. I don't like talking against my prime minister, even though perhaps I don't agree with him. And perhaps I do agree with what you're saying. But I would like to make a point, another point. It's the Israeli people that won't let anyone, not Netanyahu, not anyone, change the character of our democracy. When I was born, I was taught that there is a Declaration of Independence. This Declaration of Independence is our ID, and no one has the right to change it. And in our Declaration of Democracy, in our ID, it is written loud and clear that we're a democracy, that we thrive for peace, equality, and freedom. Mm-hmm. And no one can change it. That's our ID that our forefathers signed 74 years ago, and nobody gave no one the permission to change it.
Well, yes, but these people have been elected. So we're going to get to the bottom of this. You are right, and we've shown the pictures that a very different coalition of Israelis have come out onto the streets. We know that many former intelligence, many former security officials, including high-tech, business people who don't generally get involved in politics, and also army reservists. But Prime Minister Netanyahu has said the following to CNN about what he's doing. He's basically saying it's no different than in many other parts of the world. Here's what he said. Take a listen.
Here's a country that has exactly this provision. It's called Canada. Is Canada not a democracy? Is Britain not a democracy? Is New Zealand not a democracy? Because they all either have this provisions of such a provision, or have no ability of the court to strike down laws.
So how do you answer that? What is so different from the provisions that his government is trying to ram through?
Well, first of all, I don't like to argue with my prime minister. Maybe I would like to do it, but I would like to do it here in Israel and not through CNN. But I have to answer that you can't compare Canada to Israel. Canada has a constitution. Canada has 2 parliaments. We don't have it. But on the other side, we've got a Declaration of Democracy that is, as I said, this is our ID. And Netanyahu doesn't have the right to change it, even though he was elected by 64 members of Knesset. Do we think that we are getting into the definition of democracy. Democracy is not only the majority. Democracy is also the values. Democracy without values has it doesn't stand for nothing. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about democracy, you're talking about values, about ideals. Mm-hmm. And you have to keep those ideals, even though you were elected by majority. Majority is only the outside of democracy. The inside of democracy is the ideals that we're hailing. And our ideals is democracy and equality and liberty.
Yes, I hear you. And we see in other parts of Europe as well, as certain elected democracies are proudly calling themselves illiberal democracies by also tampering with some of the founding principles, including the judiciary. So, what are you concerned about?
We don't want to be like them.
Yes. So what exactly?
We don't want to be like those. We are very concerned that if this revolution will come through, and if those legislation will be legislated in our Knesset, the power of government will be without restriction. Mm-hmm. There will be no restriction for the empowerment of the government, and as a matter of fact, it can do whatever it wants and decide whatever it wants. And this is not a democracy. Mm-hmm. I would say this is a dictator.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Gehrman, obviously also in terms of, well, I guess for you all, it's domestic policy. For the US, it's international policy. The idea of the two-state solution, the increase in settlement units that the Prime Minister has just approved and announced. We know that the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, along with others, have been very, very upset about this. And it came right after Blinken's trip, after he asked the Prime Minister not to take unilateral steps. So Blinken has said, we're deeply troubled by Israel's decision yesterday to advance reportedly nearly 10,000 settlement units. Like previous administrations, Democratic and Republican, we strongly oppose such unilateral measures which exacerbate tensions and undermine the prospects for a negotiated two-state solution. I know there's been a lot of violence on both sides, but I want to know from you as a diplomat, is there any hope for anything resembling negotiations on a two-state solution, given that the settlements and the settlement believers are emboldened by now their backers who are in government?
Well, first of all, I would like to remind you the outstanding speech of our previous Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, in the UN, where he laid down the two-state solution very firmly and very clearly. So you have to know that there are those who think that the solution is a two-state solution, and one of them is Yair Lapid, and not only him, there are a lot of Israelis who think like him. But on the other side, I would like to point out that should I give you now a paper signed as a peace treaty with a two-state solution, and I'll tell you, go ahead, go to Ramallah, to the Muqatta, wherever you want, I wonder if you'll find one Palestinian leader that will be willing to sign it. Mm-hmm. So please remember that the Palestinians didn't want to sign the treaty that we offered them 3 times. Last time it was when Olmert, previous Prime Minister Olmert, offered a peace treaty with 96% of the territories that we were willing to give up. He gave it to Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen told him, okay, I'm going with it to my council and I'll be back. Mm-hmm. He never came back. He never gave a positive answer. So you have to remember it. And there is also one thing that I would like to point out. And I would like you to make to try it. When you come into any school in Israel and ask the students, what would you like for Israel? There will be one answer: peace. Mm-hmm. All the students, wherever you will go, will answer this. Mm-hmm. Now try to ask the same question in Gaza or in the Cisjordan. You'll get another answer, and the answer will be: we would like Israel to be out of the region. We would like all the Jews that are in Israel to be dead. Mm-hmm. They don't have the right to exist. Mm-hmm. And
Ambassador,
that is something that everyone in the world should know and should bear in mind, that on the other side there are people who doesn't want us to be alive, who doesn't think that we've got the right for our own country.
You are right. There are some people who believe that. But like you said, the majority, I think you said, most Israelis, and you said most students in Israel want peace. The latest polls from the Palestinian side also show that they want a peaceful two-state solution to coexist with you. It's a conundrum. Can I finally ask you, because your president, when he made his address to the nation, he also, well, he talked about the possibility of an explosion, a social explosion. He talked about if this all went through, it could really damage the social and political cohesion of the nation. We've seen in 2021 when, Israeli Jews and Arabs went at it. Do you think that there is any possibility of a sort of a civil conflict over this political crisis that you're facing?
I would like to believe that there is no such chance, because actually we are one people and we are very united. But you have to be aware that such a thing won't happen. That's why we're on the street. Mm-hmm. That's why we're fighting. We're fighting for our country. We're fighting for our community. We're fighting for our democracy. We're fighting for peace, to be someone. We're fighting for hope. And I'm sure that we will gain and that we will win eventually.
Really, really interesting to get your valuable perspective. And thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador Yael German. Thank you for being with us from Tel Aviv.
Thank you and good evening.
Now, the death toll across Turkey and Syria continues to climb. More than a week since the 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck the region, more than 41,000 people are now confirmed dead, with many more injured. But rescues do continue to offer hope. Just look at this video of a woman being pulled from the rubble alive after 203 hours. But as time ticks away, aid workers are saying the windows for miracles like this are coming to a close. Now the focus is on getting aid to the desperately needy. In Syria, finally, President Bashar al-Assad has opened 2 more border crossings to allow in humanitarian assistance. Joining me now to talk about all of this is the U.S. diplomat Robert Ford, who served as U.S. ambassador to Syria amid the bloody civil war. Ambassador Ford, welcome to our program. Can I ask you, I'm not sure whether you were listening to former Israeli ambassador Yael German, but she was absolutely impassioned by the need to defend Israel's, as she said, national ID, its democracy, against what she believes, and obviously many protesters believe, to be a threat in terms of a threat against an independent judiciary. What is your reaction to that? And you've heard the U.S. president and others talk about it.
Well, it's clear, Christiane, that there's a lot of disagreement in Israel, and there have been some big demonstrations there. I think there was one yesterday in Jerusalem, and there have been big demonstrations in Tel Aviv as well. What is, for me, the most striking, perhaps, is that the Biden administration, the president himself, but also the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, have actually made comments about the internal political debate in Israel, and that is not normal for an American administration.
What would be the context for the United States and for its alliance, its policies in that region or anywhere, if Israel's democracy was compromised?
Well, I think the administration is being a little careful. You'll notice that they use the word consensus, and they urge the Israeli political leadership to build a consensus among Israelis themselves. That's a kind of a nice, gentle way of the Americans saying, be careful about the steps you're taking because they are divisive. So I think longer term, I think there are people in Washington who are wondering 2 things. First, is Israel going to be a democracy or not over the medium and long term? And second, related to the 2-state solution that you were talking about briefly there, will Israel be able to maintain its status as a democracy and also a Jewish state if it in fact absorbs through annexation millions of Palestinians?
Can I ask you now to talk about what unspeakable horror in terms of a natural disaster is happening in Syria, where you were the US ambassador? We know that through international pressure, I suppose, or what is your view of why Bashar Assad has decided now to allow 2 more openings more than a week after this earthquake for his people?
Well, first of all, I have to say it's a surprise. I don't think many people expected it. I think the UN humanitarian relief boss, Martin Griffiths, talked to him. I suspect also that the United Arab Emirates Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed was just in Damascus, and I suspect he too was urging Bashar to take this step. I suspect that Assad has 2 calculations in his mind. Number one, making this gesture, and it is important, if it's implemented, it is important. It may help him normalize relations with some countries. And the second reason I suspect he did it is that he couldn't really control those 2 additional border crossings anyway. They are controlled by the Turks on the Turkish side and by Syrian rebel groups on the Syrian side, and already some non-government organizations, some aid organizations were beginning to use them. Mm-hmm. And so with this announcement from Bashar al-Assad's government, in a sense, they take credit for something that likely was going to happen with or without them.
So I was speaking to America's global ambassador at large for, humanitarian and other, accountability, war crimes and the like, Beth Van Schaack. And I asked her about, what can be done to hold a leader accountable if he or she deliberately withholds humanitarian aid against the international law. And she said that arbitrary withholding of humanitarian in an armed conflict can be a violation of the law of war, and using starvation as a weapon of war is a criminally punishable war crime. So I don't know whether you want to weigh in on that, but why do you think the leader of a country would not want to open all the floodgates, wherever they may be leading to help his people, if he wants to be considered leader of all those people?
Well, Christiane, I don't think ever since this conflict in Syria began in 2011, we have seen repeated instances where Bashar al-Assad does not particularly care about Syrian civilians who are opposed to his rule. And I'm not going to catalog all of the atrocities that the Assad government has committed against its citizens, but they are real. And therefore, for anyone to presume that he cares about all of the citizens of Syria, I think that would be quite a stretch of it.
So there are many there, particularly in the humanitarian field, like the White Helmets, who are upset with the world. They're upset that it's taken the UN and others this long to get this amount of basic humanitarian care and need into that desperately needy place. We know that the UN has just launched today a $397 million humanitarian appeal for the victims in Syria for 3 months. But here's what the head of the White Helmets has written today. Assad's intervention is a cynical move that's come far too late. The UN's insistence on waiting for the Syrian regime's permission, the very regime that has bombed, gassed, starved, forcibly displaced and imprisoned millions of Syrians, is unforgivable. I mean, is he right?
I think he's right. I don't think that donor states, and I include in that the United States, I don't think they had to wait for United Nations permission. I think they had very clear legal justification under international humanitarian law and under the Geneva Fourth Convention about the treatment of civilians in conflict areas. They had ample justification to start using those additional border crossings. I understand that the one that was approved by the United Nations, there was some road damage and that slowed it down a day or two. But the other border crossings were absolutely open, and they probably could have even flown in supplies, at least by helicopter, brought in teams. I don't blame the White Helmets director at all for being angry.
Well, and they could have airdropped, as you say. So what is it with the Security Council? Why did they wait then? Why didn't they do it? Well, why didn't your government do it?
I'm not going to speak for the administration, Christian, but I think the Russians constantly make an argument in the Security Council about defending the sovereignty of the Syrian state and its borders. But in a situation like this, international humanitarian law gives ample justification legally under international law to put aside the sovereignty issue while you are delivering urgently needed, life-saving humanitarian assistance.
Mm-hmm. And just so that we're all clear, I've been told by many officials that the sanctions that are on Syria do not play at all when it comes to this kind of humanitarian crisis, and that there are exemptions and extra measures have been taken around that. Can I just ask you whether you can comment on the other side of the border, Turkey? There has been, as we've seen, so much collapse. I mean, in Syria, sadly, so much was already rubble. I mean, it was just awful. In Turkey, that wasn't the case. And there has been so much anger from people on the ground there as well about buildings that they say that simply weren't safe. This is what was written just right now in Foreign Policy by the author of Erdogan's War, Strongman's Struggle at Home and in Syria, wrote this: powerful earthquakes kill people, but they are more deadly in countries like Turkey, where building regulations aren't enforced, unqualified loyalists fill key positions, independent state institutions do not exist, civil society organizations have been wiped out, and the interests of a corrupt few are prioritized above all else. Now, we know that the Erdogan government has called for the arrest and investigation into certain numbers of these people who are being complained against. But talk to me about that. What do you think of that criticism?
Well, I think the Erdogan government, in a sense, made it significant, and it'll turn out politically to be important, perhaps, concession to a lot of contractors operating in that part of Syria who were putting up high-rise apartment buildings. When I would visit cities like Gaziantep, they were beautiful, but apparently they did not meet Turkish government codes for construction in an active earthquake area. And the contractors knowingly built their high-rise apartment buildings that way and got a sort of amnesty from the Erdogan government in return for relatively small payments. What was in it for the Erdogan government at the time, and we're talking 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, two things. Number one, small amounts of money, but second, economic growth. And that part of Turkey historically has not been a particularly privileged economic part of Turkey. A lot of cities there sort of struggle economically. And so the construction sector was booming. And of course, that benefited President Erdogan's political fortunes. Now that bill may be coming due.
Well, let me ask you then to put on your prognosticator's hat, because Erdogan, who's been in power for some 20 years, is running again in these elections in May. And we remember that he came to power after a tragic earthquake in which he promised to fix things. So you say the bill may be...
Exactly.
Yeah, the bill may be coming due. Do you think there's anything that can dislodge him, given the, as this author pointed out, the complete lack of civil society, independent press, all of that, or the heavy sanctions against them?
Well, I think in any kind of a competition like this, and there are still democratic elements in Turkish political society. So my big question is, as I look at it, will a coalition of Turkish opposition parties, and there are 6 parties that have agreed to cooperate and work together in the upcoming election, and to all support one single candidate, will they be able to agree on that candidate? And will that candidate, in turn, run an effective campaign? And those are 2 big ifs. And I think that the future of the Turkish election will depend on the answer to those 2 questions.
It's really a remarkable period of time. Thank you so much, Ambassador Ford, for joining us.